Hi, I'm Katie from Katie Brings a Book. Hope you brought a book. If not, I brought several. Today we're going to be talking about something that I have been very excited to talk about, and that's Women's History Month. We're going to talk about historical fiction books that I've read, loved, and suggest. Women's history is something that I'm very passionate about. I've literally made it my career field, and I've enjoyed learning about it since I was little. I grew up in a household that didn't necessarily value women's contribution to history or value women outside of a very particular narrow field of their contribution to the household. But I was also born to some very strong women. My mother was, and I'm very proud of her for this. She was a glass breaker in a field that is still mainly male dominated. She was one of only two women in her graduating class for her master's degree. And she still is treated as not having knowledge, even though she has been in this field her whole life. She also is very much treated like she doesn't know what she's talking about, and she has dominated in her profession. My grandmother always raised me to believe that women could do great things, talked about women in history, um, encouraged my love of learning about women in history, no matter what others would say. And she encouraged my love of history, bought me all the books I could read. I remember loving books about women in history, even as a young girl, and at a time when it was very difficult sometimes to learn about women in history. And I am so thankful that there are more and more books about great women in history and about the lesser known women in history coming out, and about the women in history that are of all races. And we're learning about all genders in history and all races in history, all ethnicities in history, all different nationalities in history. And I love the focus in March on women's history. And so I have loved reading historical fiction since I was a young girl. It started with American Girl. I loved the books. My family couldn't afford the dolls. I never got a doll. And I was so excited when my daughter was old enough to get a doll and to get the books, and to I could collect the books for her from before she even started really getting into chapter books. I started her collection. And then it kind of sprouted from there, my love of historical fiction. And I've always read historical fiction about strong women. And now my daughter loves books about strong women. She says she calls her the kind of book she reads girls doing great things. She's not as much into the history though. But I love talking about historical fiction books. And I especially love talking about it during Women's History Month. And my students, as a history teacher, know that I'm going to talk about what I call the people in history that history tends to forget. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about the historical fiction that I've personally read and I personally suggest. This is not a complete list. There's other books that I suggest. I'm sure in other videos I will suggest them. Some of it's because I couldn't get them from the library fast enough. I don't have the funds to hold the entire historical fiction library that I would love to hold one day. Um, some of them is because I have read it, and I want to hold. I just would love to share with the world all the historical fiction that I would ever love. But today I'm going to show you some of the historical fiction that I suggest. Also, just so you know why I also am able to talk about this, I do have a degree in history. I have a bachelor's degree in history. I am an American history teacher and have been for years now. So I do know the history. Now, most of the history I suggest will be about American history because that is my specialty. And most of the focus of the research I have done and of my degree has been about women in American history. So that is most of what the books will be about, though I do throw in some world history in there as well. So let's talk about some of the ones I suggest. Again, not an exhaustive list. If you have a specific time in history that you would like to talk about some books, maybe I would suggest, send me a message. In the future, I do hope to do a series on different time periods in history and books I suggest about them. That is my dream, that is my goal. Maybe a book club forming out of it, I don't know, but I have suggested many historical fiction books to many different people because this is my passion. This is my love. This is my joy. I do read other genres, but I love talking historical fiction, specifically women's historical fiction with people, I just get like a thrill about it. And I love talking. I do read not lots of nonfiction, but I feel like his people who love history tend to love the nonfiction. People that love fiction tend to read the historical fiction. So I want you to know that I love history. And part of why I love history is because I read so much historical fiction, and I think historical fiction makes history accessible and makes us understand the people side of it. I tell my students, this is one of my catchphrases: history is the story of people. It's so much more than the names and dates. It's the people who took and lived everyday lives, like us. And all those big people we talk about, those big names and dates, they were people who lived day in and day out. They had to eat meals, they had to take naps, they had to, you know, do all the things we have to do in the minutia. And here and there were the big moments. But they had those everyday lives that we live, and especially true for women, I feel like, in history, and we tend to forget that the big moments interspersed with their everyday lives. And I think that some of these authors really get that, and they talk about the everyday lives. So let's talk about some of these major books. Some are a few years old. I don't have classics listed in here because, to me, classics are a separate genre from historical fiction. These are typically within 10 years. Most of them are within 7 to 8 years. Okay? So let's start with, I'm not going in any particular order. I'm not going in historical order. I'm not going in favorite order. I'm just picking up some semblance of what I like. Um, so let's start with one favorite author of a lot of people, and that is Alison Weir, The Last White Rose. And I'll mention that a lot of people call her the new Philippa Gregory. I have read Philippa Gregory, and a lot of people say that Alison Weir um, is a better researcher than Philippa Gregory. I fell in love with the Tudors through Philippa Gregory. A lot of people did. I'm not going to go say bad things about Philippa Gregory. I think you should read both of their Tudor history series together. The Last White Rose is about Elizabeth York, and a lot of times when we talk about the Tudors, we talk about the Six Wives. I've seen the Six musical with my sisters. Loved it. I know every line of every song. I love it. But this is pre Wives. This is the War of the Roses. I love British history. I know that I am very much a American history girly, but I do love British history as well. And this is kind of the beginnings, not the beginnings. I love British history. One day I will do a video on British history books as well. But this was just one of my, don't forget there's other histories out there. Um, and I am now delving into in the continent of African's history that I'm trying to enjoy. And then my goal is to move into Asia as well, and South America. But this is The Last White Rose. Elizabeth of York lived a fascinating life. And the War of the Roses, I think, is something in America we do not talk enough about or research. And I think that if you really want to get into like beyond opera level, soap opera level drama, if you love drama and romance and intrigue, history has it for you, and we forget that. And if you love that kind of life, check out War of the Roses, Alison Weir. I suggest, if you really want drama, start with The Last White Rose and branch out from there. But I like how Alison Weir writes. I like how Philippa Gregory writes. I think they have two different perspectives. And one thing I'm going to talk today about is perspectives in history. I tell my students the facts of the history moments don't change, but the perspectives change. And I think that is very true when it comes to historical fiction as well. So, how we view things, how we interpret things, especially as far back as the War of the Roses, which is pretty far back. There is possible murder here. There is a love story that is a star-crossed lover's love story. There is, it's all in this book, and it's all true. It happened. Next book is The Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon. My book club actually just did this. I had suggested it a while ago because I love this book. She works hard to do most things pretty historically accurate, and that is something that I value highly in a historical fiction book, is that the author has worked hard to not just research the person the book is about, but to research the time and the place and what it would have been like to be a woman, to research the clothing, the hairstyles, how they cooked, how they cleaned, how they lived, where they slept, and to really put us in that place and not pull us out by by what would they have worn or talked like, but still be able to put it in modern language. And this has been very well done in this book. This book also is a murder mystery, and I love a good murder mystery and thrillers. This book has just, it talks about also a woman who is raped and left and dies. This is set during the Revolutionary War era, kind of pre Revolutionary War and War Revolutionary War era, and she is a midwife, and this is at a time when doctors are starting to take over women's care, and there's this push and pull of should doctors take over, should midwives take over, and she believes that women should take care of women. And no matter what you believe on that, this idea of standing up for women, standing up for rape, standing up against um, very powerful men is something that I think we really need to have a discussion about and are having a discussion about in our culture, but don't discuss enough. And something that I feel very strongly about. And she has to testify. And the question becomes, can she testify against powerful men? And it is based off of a real woman who keeps a diary and is a midwife and keeps a diary of testifying in this rape case. And she also, one of the things I love in this book is her marriage. She loves her husband deeply, and they've been married for many years. They have children, and they still talk about how much they love each other, and they really do enjoy their marriage. And I find that sometimes in a lot of books that is missing. And I do really enjoy that we can have a strong woman who is strong in a career, loves her children, and also has a very strong marriage and has a husband who supports what she is doing. And so I really enjoyed this book. The murder mystery part of it was very interesting. The rape trial was interesting to see how that would have happened and did happen at this time. And then her character, based off the woman and the research that Ariel Lawhon did, was just one of my favorites that I've read. So I do highly suggest The Frozen River. It is a great book to read in winter. I know I, here in Florida, am starting to thaw out some, but I really enjoyed this book and I highly suggest it. So the next book I want to suggest is by my personal favorite author, and I actually just got to hear her speak on her book tour for the Astral Library, which I did just read, and it is her first foray into fantasy out of the historical fiction scene, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. But she is my favorite author, and she is Kate Quinn, and this is her first more modern historical fiction. So she did the Bourgeois series and the Borgia series, and she did the Mistress of Rome series, and then she entered into what we call the more modern history series. This is the Alice Network, which features World War One and Two. And I'll tell you, as somebody who believes we should study World War One very in depth, it is hard to find historical fiction books, especially about women in World War One. And I think that that is something that is greatly lacking, and we should study it far more because there's so much about modern history set and that it changed because of World War One. So the Alice Network, though, of her books is still and probably will always be my favorite. If you're going to get into Kate Quinn, I always suggest people start with the Alice Network. I have suggested this book to so many people and so many people love it. Kate Quinn does so much research, which is why it takes a while for her books to come out. This is such a well researched book. She goes into the research after you read the book, and it's the character, the main character, is based on Edith Cavell, who was a spy in World War One and kind of changed the face of what we think of women able to do in spies and deeply impacted how spies were used in World War II. And we don't ever talk about her. I talk about her in my classes, in my history classes in ninth grade a lot. But if you were alive in World War One in America, you knew who Edith Cavell was, and we don't even speak her name anymore most of the time. Highly suggest the Alice Network. Um, it will make you cry though, and it doesn't just deal with spies in World War One. It also deals with pregnancy, unwed mothers. It deals there's a romance in here, I am not a romance person, but this romance touched my cold heart. And so when romances can touch my cold heart, they're going to be good. She does do some spicy scenes, so I do try to talk about that a little bit. But I am such a huge Kate Quinn fan, and this is the one to fall in love with Kate Quinn. Next is my one of my other favorite authors, and this is my favorite of her books. And introduced me to one of my other favorite authors, who I have another one of her books. But Marie Benedict had been a favorite for a while, and then she joined with Victoria Christopher Murray to bring us The First Ladies. And they two of them have another book called The Personal Librarian, and I wanted to feature it, but I had loaned it to a student. The student is still reading it, which is a good thing because it means that it's being read and a student is enjoying it. And so I don't have it for the video, but I also suggest their other book, The Personal Librarian. The First Ladies, though, is about the friendship between Mary McLeod Bethune and Eleanor Roosevelt. And these two ladies, we don't talk about Mary McLeod Bethune enough, and we don't talk about their friendship. And I didn't know about their friendship. I knew who Mary McLeod Bethune was. I knew who Eleanor Roosevelt was. She's one of my heroes in history. I'm from Florida, and Mary McLeod Bethune is an African American woman from Daytona Beach, Florida. She founded Bethune Cookman College. She is pioneer for African American women's education in general. But I didn't know that they were very close friends. And without Mary McLeod Bethune, a lot of the programs in the New Deal would not have existed. And I had no idea until I read this book. I stayed up late reading it multiple nights. It is a rather large book. There are parts that are a little bit dry. It is not, but Marie Benedict is not Kate Quinn. Kate Quinn is action a mile a minute. Marie Benedict is deep dive into these women's lives. But I learned so much in this book and really fell in love with these two women and their friendship, and realized that the two of them and their friendship changed America for sure. And I highly suggest this book if you're interested in how their friendship worked. Mary McLeod Bethune just really was willing to say to Eleanor, like, you don't even see the microaggressions and the macroaggressions and the racism that's under your own nose. And she was willing to call her out, and then pushed Eleanor to call out what was wrong. And I just really appreciated this book for calling it out. And I actually just taught about their friendship. I've been teaching the Great Depression to my students in my history classroom. And so I was talking about their friendship, and then a couple of my students got so excited and so interested in their friendship, that they actually picked Mary McLeod Bethune for their Black History Month project that we did, and then picked Eleanor Roosevelt for Women's History Month project because they'd already done Mary McLeod Bethune, for Black History Month. And it was really neat to see this book then featured to then get to be kind of spread past it. But this book, it just really led me down a rabbit hole of learning about them, learning about the powerhouse of a woman that was Mary McLeod Bethune. Beyond, I went down a research rabbit hole about her, realized how impactful she was, working in government, working for young African Americans during this time, and who she was as a person. So, The First Ladies, also The Personal Librarian by these two women, also a highly suggested book. The next book is by Victoria Christopher Murray. She is one of the co-authors of The First Ladies, Harlem Rhapsody. It is about the Harlem Renaissance in 1919, and I've always taught about the Harlem Renaissance. I show the artwork. I read the poetry with my students. And it's always been very easy for me to be like, yeah, that was what happened. And then I read the book and it became personal for me. And it helped me to talk about the real moments. And I don't feel like I can say much more beyond this book moved me. Um, I feel like It is a must read. Um, I have a hard time knowing what else to say about this book beyond you should read it, because I don't fully feel qualified as a white person to say much more about this book. And I'm just going to leave that there and say that I my experiences are that this book moved me. This book helped me to understand the Harlem Renaissance in a new way, beyond just what I know from a textbook, what I've read from the primary sources. It helped me to experience it as the story of individuals and of people. And I highly suggest reading this and experiencing this book. I am excited for Victoria Christopher Murray to write more. I hope she does write more, and I will be pre ordering everything she writes. Um, the next book is something that I really enjoyed this book. It's been a few years since I've read it. I love the musical Hamilton. I have read the Ron Chernow biography that it's written off of. Um, but Eliza Hamilton is one of my heroes in history that we need to talk more about. And Stephanie Dray and Laura Camoy wrote My Dear Hamilton. And a lot of times, if you like history or don't like history and just like the musical, you think that that's the only way you can know the story. And Stephanie Dray, who has written a lot of historical fiction, and I do enjoy a lot of her historical fiction. I also loved her portrayal of Frances Perkins. Um, she changes a lot of the perspectives that are featured in the Ron Chernow auto or biography and the musical, um, especially about the Reynolds pamphlet. And I think that it is another perspective we really need to have. As I tell my students, the facts you can't argue with, the perspectives and how the things were seen and what happened behind the scenes, that's based off of biased perspective. We don't know all the facts. So I think that if you are a lover of the musical, if you're a lover of anything Hamilton, you need to read this book. Women's history or not, this gives a very good background information. Eliza did a ton of things outside of her husband. She lived another, I think, 50 years. She did all kinds of stuff after his death. She opened an orphanage. She witnessed the founding father's death. She did all kinds of things, and all she's known by is that her husband was in a duel. And so I highly suggest this book by Stephanie Dray and Laura Camoy. Stephanie Dray is another one that I enjoy. And I think also if you're into the musical, you should read this book for just a different perspective on Hamilton and especially on Eliza. Angelica as well. It has a very different perspective on Angelica. And I think, and on Peggy, and very different, much more historically accurate perspective on Angelica. And the musical took a lot of license with Angelica that I didn't realize until I started to read that book and do my own research. And so I think that that's a good. We should we should check our sources always, and read both sides. And I think that that's a very good second option to enjoy with the musical. This next one is Liberty by Caitlin Greenidge. Greenidge, I hope I'm saying that correctly. Reconstruction. This is Brooklyn, and then there's a lot also about Haiti, which I think is something, the Caribbean is something that I'm interested in learning more about during this period. And again, this is something that I think that I want to learn about more. I want to read more books. I wish that she would write a lot more. And if she has, and I haven't read more of it, then help me know that. Coming of age and then into her early marriage. It's inspired by the first African American female doctor. And also about her love of art. It's about Reconstruction, which is the time after the Civil War. And there's a lot of books about the Civil War, about before the Civil War. Then we kind of like skip a lot and we go to the civil rights movement. but there's a lot that happens there. And as a history teacher, I hate that we don't write a lot about the time in between. Um, and so I think that this is a really good introduction if you want to learn more about what happened between the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement, especially right after the Civil War, as there was this question of what was going to happen. And so I highly suggest Liberty, by Caitlin Greenidge. I think that it was a beautiful book that really talks about both being a woman, being an African American woman during this time, and also being what she falls in love with a Haitian American man, a Haitian man, and then that dichotomy of Caribbean American, Caribbean, African American, and how that all played out as well during Reconstruction. And so this is just like it's one of those books that the emotions in me don't know how to translate that, but I highly suggest this book. And last but not least is a book that came out last year, and I almost didn't read it. And I'm so glad now that I did. It was suggested by a bunch of different, like, people on Bookstagram that I follow and people that suggested it, but it is a hard book. It is sad. And it is about something that we are beginning to talk about in history and we need to talk more about. And it is The Lies They Told Me and the eugenics program here in the United States. The Lies They Told Me is about immigration, which we need to be talking way more about right now. In America, when you talk about legal immigration, we need to talk about how immigration has evolved in America, through Ellis Island and Angel Island, which we don't talk a lot about. We talk about Ellis Island. We don't talk about Angel Island in California. We need to talk about what did this whole idea of immigration look like, and then coming to the United States, and the idea of, um, you know, prejudice against immigrants, as somebody whose grandmother was prejudiced against and came through Ellis Island. And then when a lot of the immigrants came here, what did that look like? And the eugenics program. And this this book really does a good job of talking about a time in history that we can now really relate to in today's America. And I think that this needs to be kind of a required reading today for everybody, not just American history. And so I wanted to end on this book, The Lies They Told Me by Ellen Marie Wiseman, because I think this needs to be required reading just for today, to see, to talk today about why what we're going through is not new and it is horrible. And we need to be discussing immigration and we need to be discussing how this needs to be not something that we're just prejudiced against people because of their immigration status or their race or where they come from or how they got here. But we need to be, um, talking about what happens to them and who they are as people. And I think that this is a very good book for everyone right now. Hi, I am adding this part of the video on 24 hours after making the first video because I'm human and I refuse to be one of those people who says I'm perfect and I have it all together and I'm going to act like I have it all together, but I don't. I made that first video and I thought I had missed a few books. Well, sure enough, I did. I left some of the books from the library in my van. Then I realized as I was getting those books that I left one of them in my classroom, which is locked over the weekend, which is when I'm making this. So I'm going to talk about these books because I feel like they're still very important books. I feel like they're great books for Women's History Month. And they're books that deal with what we would call, in kind of the history world, the masses. But history is the story of people and not just the big names. It's the story of the everyday people, like me, like you, who lived out these experiences, who lived out the moments in history, who lived through them, who lived during them. We are living in history right now. And they may not be the big names, but they experienced history and they lived through moments, they lived through things. And oftentimes it's those people that we relate to the most. And these are books that I related to or that I learned from their experiences. Maybe me and my life couldn't relate to, but I learned from their experiences and was able to understand because of my white privilege or because of my experience, never experienced something like that, but I was able to learn from it. So I really wanted to highlight these books still. So I am coming on here to say I am imperfect, but I wanted to include these books. The first book, I am even more imperfect because it got left in my classroom over the weekend. And it is one I actually just read, and I read it for Black History Month in February. It had been on my shelf for a year. And I kind of went, why did I not read this sooner? And so I took it to my classroom. I suggest it for my students now that I've read it a month ago, but I'm going to include it in this video. All We Were Promised. It features an enslaved woman and a woman who was born to an affluent African American freed family in Philadelphia just before the Civil War. And they become friends. And the formerly enslaved woman and her father had run away and were passing in Philadelphia. And I'm not going to give away too much of the book, but it's a it's a wonderful book about what it was like for African Americans during this time. It really opened up my eyes in a way. It presented things. I've read a lot of books about enslaved women, about this period, and this book was very unique to me. And I wanted to make sure I included it because I didn't know a lot about the Philadelphia movement and abolition movement during this time until I read this book. I had learned a lot about Lucretia Mott, who was in Philadelphia during this time, but that was from a white perspective. And the African American perspective meant so much more to me. And so I highly suggest it for Women's History Month because I think that it really puts a unique perspective and helped me to see that I needed to learn more. Now moving on, this next book, I recently heard the author, speak, and found out that she actually lives not too far from me, which was neat. It is my first book by this author. I did it as an audiobook, so I got the book from the library. I am not a big audiobook person, but this one actually kept me engaged. The Secret Book Society by Madeline Martin. I found out that it seems like all of her books have a book kind of setting, and I'm very into that. So I plan to read more by her. It deals with domestic violence and set in England, which I do enjoy. British, I do enjoy getting out of my American history kind of very specific niche. But these women in English society come together and create a book society for specifically for women who are experiencing domestic violence of some kind or domestic abuse or control. And books are their gateway for getting out or for experiencing peace. And as somebody who is a domestic violence survivor, I find that that is something that really hit home for me because books have been my peace and my escape. Um, it is a beautifully written work, but also a lot of action, which I really enjoyed, and the heart of being in that place was really well written. Um, Thoroughly enjoyed this book. Definitely suggest it. The next one is something that I really enjoyed this book. I read it in just a couple days while I was on vacation. And so I'll have to be honest, I am not like go on vacation, read a light beach read. It's not my style. When I go on vacation, I prefer murder mysteries and dark historical fiction. That's my light reads. Madness So Discreet is about women who have been put in insane asylums or deemed too hysterical by men of the time period and dealing with insane asylums. And just, it is something that I think that we need to be talking about more. We need to talk about the history of the term hysterical, the history of insanity in the United States, both as women and as a racial issue. It is a massive racial issue. This book really takes a hand into what did what was women's role in insane asylums. And I think that it is an easy, it wasn't, how do I say this? It was a emotional read, but the writing style was not hard to read, if that makes any sense. I really enjoyed it. Um, and I think that this is a good read if you want a kind of introduction into the idea of insanity in insane asylums for women during this, I believe it was the 1800s. Really explores that theory. And continuing, our last book continues the idea somewhat of insanity. The Lobotomist Wife. This is not a super well known book, I feel like. And lobotomies, if you haven't done your research, highly suggest learning about them. But they were done to control what was considered uh, insanity during this time. This is set after World War II. She marries one of the men who is kind of the forefront of lobotomies, and it's not just about her, but more about lobotomies in general, bringing view into lobotomies, but also the concept of how do we control women? How did women get controlled by the mental health system? And the view of what were the results of lobotomies. If you don't know what a lobotomy is, that is when they would take typically an ice pick and put it through the eye socket and then kind of swish it around in there and disconnect part of the brains. But there was never a system for how much. And so many times it would take the patients and make them somewhat catatonic. This was done to John F. Kennedy's sister, Rosemary. She is probably the most famous person, but it was done to many, many, many people. And what started as, for the most part, like a very positive, seemingly way of dealing with mental health issues, I say started as it was not. I they in the beginning it was a hopeful way of maybe helping people, but then it really devolved into a way to control what was considered, and this is very debatable. So you are welcome. I don't know that I fully, it's hard to say. Lobotomies are a very controversial. Hi, I am adding this part of the video on 24 hours after making the first video because I'm human and I refuse to be one of those people who says I'm perfect and I have it all together and I'm going to act like I have it all together, but I don't. I made that first video and I thought I had missed a few books. Well, sure enough, I did. I left some of the books from the library in my van. Then I realized as I was getting those books that I left one of them in my classroom, which is locked over the weekend, which is when I'm making this. So I'm going to talk about these books because I feel like they're still very important books. I feel like they're great books for Women's History Month. And they're books that deal with what we would call, in kind of the history world, the masses. But history is the story of people and not just the big names. It's the story of the everyday people, like me, like you, who lived out these experiences, who lived out the moments in history, who lived through them, who lived during them. We are living in history right now. And they may not be the big names, but they experienced history and they lived through moments, they lived through things. And oftentimes it's those people that we relate to the most. And these are books that I related to or that I learned from their experiences. Maybe me and my life couldn't relate to, but I learned from their experiences and was able to understand because of my white privilege or because of my experience, never experienced something like that, but I was able to learn from it. So I really wanted to highlight these books still. So I am coming on here to say I am imperfect, but I wanted to include these books. The first book, I am even more imperfect because it got left in my classroom over the weekend. And it is one I actually just read, and I read it for Black History Month in February. It had been on my shelf for a year, and I kind of went, why did I not read this sooner? And so I took it to my classroom. I suggest it for my students now that I've read it a month ago, but I'm going to include it in this video. All We Were Promised. It features an enslaved woman and a woman who was born to an affluent African American freed family in Philadelphia just before the Civil War. And they become friends. And the formerly enslaved woman and her father had run away and were passing in Philadelphia. And I'm not going to give away too much of the book, but it's a it's a wonderful book about what it was like for African Americans during this time. It really opened up my eyes in a way. It presented things. I've read a lot of books about enslaved women, about this period, and this book was very unique to me. And I wanted to make sure I included it because I didn't know a lot about the Philadelphia movement and abolition movement during this time until I read this book. Um, I had learned a lot about Lucretia Mott, who was in Philadelphia during this time, but that was from a white perspective. And the African American perspective meant so much more to me. And so I highly suggest it for Women's History Month because I think that it really puts a unique perspective and helped me to see that I needed to learn more. Now moving on, this next book, I recently heard the author, speak, and found out that she actually lives not too far from me, which was neat. It is my first book by this author. I did it as an audiobook, so I got the book from the library. I am not a big audiobook person, but this one actually kept me engaged. The Secret Book Society by Madeline Martin. I found out that it seems like all of her books have a book kind of setting, and I'm very into that. So I plan to read more by her. It deals with domestic violence and set in England, which I do enjoy. British, I do enjoy getting out of my American history kind of very specific niche. But these women in English society come together and create a book society for specifically for women who are experiencing domestic violence of some kind or domestic abuse or control. And books are their gateway for getting out or for experiencing peace. And as somebody who is a domestic violence survivor, I find that that is something that really hit home for me because books have been my peace and my escape. Um, it is a beautifully written work, but also a lot of action, which I really enjoyed, and the heart of being in that place was really well written. Um, Thoroughly enjoyed this book. Definitely suggest it. These last two deal with what would be considered mental illness, and I don't want to call mental illness just mental illness at this time because it was anything that could be used to control a woman or anything that a woman that would speak her mind outside of what was considered her quote unquote place, um, or a woman who was different, or and it could be what we would consider traditional mental illness post, or it could be post. I mean, it could be anything like this. And as somebody who in the past has struggled with, anxiety and depression, postpartum depression, honestly, this one is something that has hit close to home, but also as someone that is somebody who speaks my mind and has a different opinion than others. I also see these women as something that I can relate to as well. And so, sometimes what often would have been called, like witches in, the 1600s or even in medieval Europe, then we call the insane during, we move into the 1800s and early 1900s. And so, even into mid 1900s. And so that's what these last two books are about, is what we would call insanity. This next one I took on vacation and read in only a couple days on what was kind of a stressful vacation for me, honestly. And so a lot of people take like beach reads on vacation. I take mental illness historical fiction on vacation that, oh, by the way, is also a murder mystery. And it was the perfect vacation book for me. I loved it. I was engrossed. I couldn't put it down. A Madness So Discreet by Mindy McGinnis. I love this book. I I just I want to reread all of these. Like, going through this video has made me want to reread every single book, but this one especially because I don't remember the ending of it now that I think about it, and I want to remember the ending. So this woman, we start with this woman can't speak. She doesn't speak, and so she gets put in an insane asylum. And insane asylums at this time were just they're horrible places for women, especially. And she talks about the different women in the insane asylum, and they're uh, trying to find some semblance of humanity in this just totally inhumane place, and the way they're treated, and their different struggles with what they're with their different mental illnesses or their different um, just their differences, whatever their difference is, and how they find their bright spots in humanity. But also, she gets pulled into this murder mystery and the beginnings of criminal psychology. It's reminds me a little bit of The Alienist by Caleb Carr, if you've ever read that. That's also a great one, just doesn't fit with Women's History Month. Reminded me a little bit of that book, but if you like murder mysteries with women's historical fiction, highly suggest A Madness So Discreet. It is not well known. I think I just happened upon it in my library one day, or like a library suggestion, but it is a great book. And this last book is another one that I just happened upon. Um, is not well known, but also deals with mental illness and how we dealt in dealing with women who were more outspoken or maybe a little different. And it's The Lobotomist Wife by Samantha Green Woodruff. Again, not a book super well talked about. The lobotomies, if you don't know, you really should research them, because lobotomies, we went from just putting people in insane asylums to what do we do with them? Like, how to this idea of, okay, we what do we do, especially with the wealthier, with those who had a little bit of money, and this new very extreme um, surgery called lobotomy comes out. And the lobotomy, if you don't know, I don't really want to go into graphic details, but it's a pretty terrible procedure. And Rosemary Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's sister, gets one, and it completely changes personalities. Typically, there's no real generalized procedure for it, there's not anesthesia for it. And it's done to women, not just those who have severe mental illnesses, but it's done to women who are just different or speak up or have postpartum depression, or maybe, I mean, it's just kind of done. I mean, it's done in hotel rooms. It's just done to anybody, and it doesn't take much. Basically, your husband just has to say that you need to have it, and get a doctor sign off. And this woman it's historical fiction. Um, based it's the based off the wife of one of the head surgeons of it, and I say surgeons with air quotes, surgeons. And she starts by really believing in the procedure and her husband, and as the book goes on, starting to see what her husband's doing, but it really goes into what it's like for the victims of this procedure. And I really like it's something that there is not much else. I have looked for other books about lobotomies. Um, it's something we are beginning to talk about because it's not been very long since this was a standard practice. I mean, we're talking about like it was, I mean, boomers were born, and when the boomer generation was born, it was still happening. So this is not very long since this has been historic, since this has been standard operating procedure. So there's not a lot going on, but this book does a good job of explaining what was happening, why people were doing it, how it was deemed such a great revolutionary thing, and then discovering how terrible it was. So this really does, and I think those two books do a good job of understanding how this concept of mental illness was used to control women and the masses of women who might be not just who might have mental illness of some kind and just were controlled, but also just women who were different, who wanted to live life differently than was prescribed for them, or just have thoughts and ideas and wanted to discuss this. There's a lot of nonfiction about this, but there's not a lot of historical fiction about this. And I think partially because it makes us really uncomfortable to think about. And I love historical fiction that makes us really uncomfortable. And so these last few books should make you really uncomfortable. I want this to make you really uncomfortable. But life should make us really uncomfortable. And I think especially these last four books I've talked about are books that you should read right now in the America we live in, because they should make us want to help others. They should make us want to say, this was not okay then. People should have spoken up then, and I should speak up now for those who cannot speak up for themselves. Because that is the theme of these last four books, is these women couldn't speak up for themselves. Somebody needed to speak up for them. And there are many right now in the United States that have no one to speak up for them, that have been silenced. And if we have the privilege to speak up for them, we should be. I have the privilege to speak up and say, it is not right what is going on.